If you like what you see, go ahead and subscribe to see more of our content. And also make sure to ring the bell if you actually want to see our content. Thanks, YouTube. If you really like what you see, you should know that we did this all with a budget of 2 shoelaces and some pocket lint. Just imagine what we can do with an actual budget. By checking out our Patreon, you can find out. Thank you to all of our other new patrons at different tiers. You're helping support the channel while also getting early access to our videos. You should definitely start with our affiliate link down in the description whenever you make a purchase over at TCG Player. Alright, that's the shameless promotion out of the way. Let's go ahead and get into the video. Hey everyone, it's Matt here, and this week's game is bullshit. At least from an editing standpoint. The game itself clocks in at a whopping 24 minutes, and features 4 decks, which play a ton of interaction and trigger-based effects. We've got a whole lot of ground to cover though, so let's not waste any more time and jump straight in to player introductions. First off this week is Josh, playing his take on Kykar Wind's Fury. And for the first time in one of our games, I think Josh's opening hand is a perfect indicator of what his deck does. He kept Hive-Mind, Glorious End, Sundial of the Infinite, Emry Lurker of the Loch, Sea of Clouds, Rugged Prairie, and a snow-covered island. Next up is Michael, looking for a win once again with his Riku of 2 Reflections deck. This is a similar spell-slinging deck to the last time he played it, but with a focus on a brand new combo. Michael kept an island, Growth Spiral, Echo of Aeons, Factor Fiction, Simic Signet, Vandal Blast, and Steam Vents. Then comes Devin, who's bringing a long dismantled deck back to life, all helmed by Ayli Eternal Pilgrim. This is a fairly straightforward Orzhov Sacrifice deck with some neat tricks built in to make sure Devin has a chance to interact at instant speed and keep up with the other decks. He kept a fast hand with Mana Vault, Arcane Signet, Night's Whisper, Solemn Simulacrum, Karmic Guide, a Plains, and a Swamp. Last but certainly not least, we have Danny, playing Vadrok Apex of Thunder. Here we have our last spell-slinging deck, but it tends to focus on spells with CMC 3 or less. Danny kept Port Town, Prairie Stream, an Island, Soul Ring, Mystic Remora, Narset's Reversal, and Dorat the Perfect Pet. Josh starts us off. He drops an untapped Sea of Clouds, and passes off. Michael drops a tapped Breeding Pool. Devin drops a Swamp, and taps it to play a Mana Vault. He then uses the Vault to cast an Arcane Signet, before closing out his first turn with a Night's Whisper, losing 2 life, before drawing 2 cards. Danny drops an Island, and casts the saddest Mystic Remora. Josh drops a Mountain. He casts a Sundial of the Infinite, which gives Danny a draw, as Josh passes off. Michael drops a Mountain as well. He also has a turn 2 play in the form of a Simic Signet, which gives Danny another draw. Devin untaps, and can't pay to untap Mana Vault. He takes the damage after his draw, and then drops a Plains. He casts his commander Ayli, and then passes turn. Danny untaps, and pays for Mystic Remora on his upkeep. He drops a Port Town untapped, revealing a Prairie Stream, and then casts a Soul Ring before passing off again. Josh drops an Island. He casts Emry Lurker of the Loch, and mills these 4 cards as she enters. Josh then passes turn. Michael drops an Island, and passes. Devin drops a Swamp. He moves to combat, and swings Ayli at Danny for 2. In main 2, Devin casts a Solemn Simulacrum to bring in a tapped Swamp. He then passes off, and remembers his damage from Mana Vault, as Danny untaps, and pays to keep Mystic Remora once again. Danny then plays a tapped Prairie Stream, and passes turn. Josh drops a Shivan Reef. He casts Kykar Wind's Fury, and in response, Michael casts a Growth Spiral. Danny draws from Remora, and then Michael draws and puts in a tapped Steam Vents. Kykar then resolves, and Josh passes off. Michael untaps, and passes turn without playing a land. Devin drops a Plains, and then remembers his damage from Mana Vault, before sacrificing Solemn to Ayli to gain 2 life, and draw a card. He follows up with a Karmic Guide, and uses it to bring back Solemn. Devin searches for another land, and claims he'll be moving to combat. Hearing that, Danny casts an Enlightened Tutor to search his library and cut down time. In response to that, Michael casts a Fact or Fiction, and chooses Josh, before revealing these 5 cards. Josh doesn't see anything he feels frightened by, so in exchange for a favor, he lets Michael take them all. Danny forgets a fish as the Enlightened Tutor resolves, and he goes to put Search for his Kanta on top of his library. Devin then moves to combat, and swings 2 at Michael, before passing off. Danny doesn't pay for Mystic Remora on his upkeep. He drops a Clifftop Retreat, and follows it up with Dorat. He then replaces his Mystic Remora with a Rhystic Study. That cast gives Dorat a +1/+1 counter, and then Danny moves to combat, and hits Michael for 2, before passing turn. Josh plays an untapped Glacial Fortress, and passes turn. Michael drops a Boseiju tapped. He casts Manamorphose, and gives Danny a draw on that cast. Michael then draws, and floats 2 red mana from Manamorphose. He overloads a Vandal Blast, once again triggering Rhystic Study. Josh responds to that with a Glorious End. He pays for Rhystic Study on that cast, and then creates a Spirit. The turn then ends, exiling the stack in the process. Devin doesn't pay for Karmic Guide's Echo cost, before losing a life to Mana Vault on his draw. He drops a Swamp, and then casts an Ashen Rider. Danny draws a card on that cast, and then Devin decides to be nice to Josh, and exiles Rhystic Study instead of Sundial. Devin then moves to combat, and swings 4 at Danny, and says this:
Matt, I want you to note in the game that I could have taken Josh out. Please.
Before passing off, Danny shocks in a Sacred Foundry. He mutates his commander on top of Dorat, and recasts Mystic Remora with the Mutate trigger. That adds a counter to his commander, and then Danny bins a Restore Balance at end step before passing turn. Josh drops a Rugged Prairie. He casts a Hive-Mind, and doesn't pay the extra for Mystic Remora, so Danny draws a card. Josh creates a Spirit on that cast, and before Hive-Mind resolves, Danny casts Frantic Search. Search adds another counter to his commander, and then Danny draws 2, and discards 2, before untapping 3 lands. Hive-Mind then resolves, and Josh moves to his end step. Glorious End's delayed trigger is put on the stack, and Josh responds by activating Sundial of the Infinite. In response to that, Danny casts Generous Gift, targeting Hive-Mind. He adds a counter to his commander, and then Josh debates this.
How badly do I want Mike in the game?
Do you want to what? Me?
Yes, because I can make you lose next turn.
He ultimately decides against it, and then Hive-Mind triggers, and each player other than Danny copies Generous Gift. Josh's copy targets Rodan, Michael targets Mana Vault, and Devin targets Kykar. All the appropriate permanents are destroyed, and the appropriate players also create 3/3 elephants. And after all of that, Sundial ends the turn, getting around the Glorious End trigger. Michael starts his turn off by casting a Soul Ring. He flashes back Echo of Aeons, and Danny draws a card from Remora, which is about to get shuffled back in. After the wheel, Michael drops an island for turn. He then shocks himself with Beseiju to cast a Sensei's Divining Top, all so he can pay for Mystic Remora and send a message. Michael then passes turn. Devin drops a swamp. He casts Sheoldred and moves to combat. He swings 5 each at Danny and Michael before passing off. Danny untaps and sacrifices his elephant on his upkeep. He also pays to keep Mystic Remora and then drops a mountain for turn. He casts an Izzet Signet and follows up with the Locust God. Danny then passes turn. Josh sacrifices one of his elephants on his upkeep. He drops an Adhikar Wastes and then recasts his commander. He casts an Izzet Signet and gives Danny a draw, while creating a 1/1 spirit and watching Danny create a 1/1 insect. Josh then does the same thing with both a Boros Signet and a Talisman of Creativity, before passing off to Michael. Michael drops a forest, and then casts his commander Riku. He then passes turn, and at his end step, Devin sacrifices Ashen Rider to Ayli, completely missing his life gain, and exiling the Locust God in the process. Devin then untaps, and reanimates Ashen Rider with Sheoldred on his upkeep. He exiles Sundial the Infinite as it enters, and then plays a swamp for turn. He casts Athreos the Shroud Veiled, and follows it up with a Ravenous Chupacabra. In response, Michael shocks himself to cast a Mystic Confluence. His choices are to counter the Chupacabra unless Devin pays 3, to bounce Sheoldred, and to bounce Athreos. Danny draws a card from Mystic Remora, and then Mystic Confluence resolves through. After that, Devin moves to combat and hits Michael for 10, before passing turn. Danny sacrifices Mystic Remora on his upkeep, as Devin finally remembers his life gain from Ayli. Danny then drops an island, and casts a Monastery Mentor. He follows up with a Brainstorm, and draws 3, before putting 2 back. Danny then remembers both his Monk token and Prowess triggers. He mutates his commander onto the Monk token he just created, and in response to that mutate trigger, Josh pings himself to cast a Mystical Tutor, while also creating a spirit from Kykar. Josh finds a Windfall for the top of his library, and then Danny recasts his Mystic Remora once again. He triggers Prowess, and somehow forgets his Monk token, before discarding down at end step and passing off. Josh drops a mountain. He casts a Whirlwind of Thought, and Danny draws from Mystic Remora as Josh creates another spirit. Josh then casts a Merchant Scroll, and gives Danny another draw from Remora. Josh also draws from Whirlwind of Thought, and misses a spirit token from Kykar, before going to grab a Cyclonic Rift to hand. He uses the Rift to target and bounce Ashen Rider. And in quick succession, Danny draws from Remora, and Devin sacrifices Ashen Rider down to Ayli to gain 5 life, while also exiling Riku. Josh then pings himself with Adhikar Wastes, before remembering both his draw from Whirlwind and his spirit token from Kykar. He casts Windfall, and both he and Danny draw on that cast. Josh creates a spirit from Kykar, and then everyone goes to wheel away their hand before drawing 11. After the wheel, Josh casts Unwinding Clock, and both he and Danny draw again, before Josh creates a spirit. Josh then moves to end step, and discards down, before passing turn. Michael untaps, and Josh untaps his artifacts alongside him. Michael then shocks in a Stomping Ground, and casts a Cultivate, as Danny draws a card on that cast. Michael then uses Cultivate to bring in a tapped Forest and a Mountain to hand. He casts a Day's Undoing, and Danny draws again, but once again, it doesn't really matter. After the wheel, Day's Undoing exiles itself as it ends Michael's turn. Devin untaps, and on his upkeep, Michael activates Top to rearrange the top 3 of his library, as Devin plays a Swamp for turn. Devin recasts Ashen Rider, and exiles Whirlwind of Thought as it ETBs. He then moves to combat, and swings 3 at Josh, before casting a WUR Strider. As Devin goes to make his GOAT token, Danny untaps and sacrifices Mystic Remora. He drops an untapped Glacial Fortress, and then casts a Jeskai Ascendancy. He creates a Monk on that cast, and also triggers Prowess. He follows up with a Chromatic Lantern, and creates a Monk, while also triggering both Prowess and non-keyworded Prowess from Ascendancy. And then he also loots a card from Ascendancy. Danny moves to combat, and swings Mentor at Michael, 3 Insects at Devin, and his Commander at Josh. Josh blocks with a Spirit, and then Devin and Michael both take damage as Danny passes turn. Josh drops a Reliquary Tower. He transmutes a Muddle the Mixtures, and goes to 2-door up a Goblin Engineer to hand. He casts the Engineer, and uses its ETB to bin a Chromatic Orrery. He then activates Emery to cast the Orrery, and creates a Spirit on that cast. He follows up with a Talisman of Conviction, and creates yet another Spirit. Next comes his own copy of Day's Undoing, as he forgets to create his Spirit from Kykar. In response, Devin sacrifices Ashen Rider again to exile Chromatic Orrery, while scrying a card from WUR Strider. Danny responds with the exile on the stack, and casts a Pouncing Shore Shark for its Mutate cost. In response to that, Josh casts a Discontinuity to end the turn, and creates another Spirit on that cast. With Discontinuity on the stack, Devin sacrifices his GOAT to WUR Strider to scry a card. The stack is then exiled, and we move to Michael's turn. Michael untaps, and Josh untaps his artifacts as well. Michael then drops a Forest, and recasts his Commander Riku. He follows up with a Manamorphose, which he pays to copy with Riku's trigger. Michael floats 2 green, a blue, and a red, and then draws 2 cards. He follows up with an Izzet Signet, and then casts a Spellseeker. In response to Spellseeker, Josh activates Orrery to draw 3 cards. Michael then goes to tutor up a Mana Severance to hand, and passes off while he searches. Devin untaps, and you know the drill at this point. He drops a Plains for turn, and then casts an Entomb. In response, Josh does the Orrery trick again to draw 3 more cards. Still before Entomb resolves, Michael spins the top to rearrange the top 3 of his library. Entomb finally resolves, and Devin puts a Massacre Worm into his graveyard. After that, he casts an Unburial Rites to return it to the battlefield. And with that cast on the stack, Danny targets Devin's WUR Strider with Cyclonic Rift. Ascendancy and Prowess both trigger, and pump Danny's board, and he also loots again, before untapping his creatures. With Cyclonic Rift on the stack, Josh sacrifices both of his spirits to cast a Mystical Tutor. He creates another spirit on that cast, and puts Idyllic Tutor on top of his library. Josh then uses his own Psych Rift to bounce Jeskai Ascendancy back to Danny's hand, and then sacrifices the spirit he creates. Everything then resolves through, and Massacre Worm gives Devin's opponent's creatures -2/-2 until end of turn. Michael and Josh each take 4 from Massacre Worm, and then Danny takes 2, as Devin sacrifices Massacre Worm down to Ayli. he gains 6 life, and then flashes back on Burial Rites to bring the Massacre Worm back into play. Everything but Danny's commander is wiped, and Danny takes 10 damage, as Josh takes an additional 4. Devin then moves to combat, and hits Josh for 7 before passing turn. Danny drops Plains, as Josh remembers to untap his artifacts. Danny recasts Ascendancy, and casts See the Truth. He triggers both Ascendancy and Prowess, before looting a card. Then See the Truth resolves, and Danny looks at the top 3 of his library, and puts 1 to hand, before bottoming the other 2. Danny then casts Serum Visions, and triggers both Ascendancy and Prowess, before holding priority to cast an Enlightened Tutor, once again triggering both Ascendancy and Prowess. Danny goes to put Runechanter's Pike on top of his library, and draws it from Serum Visions, before scrying away 2 cards. Danny then casts Runechanter's Pike, and triggers both Prowess and Ascendancy again, before looting a card. He casts an Underworld Breach, and triggers both Prowess and Ascendancy again. Danny escapes See the Truth, and triggers both Prowess and Ascendancy again. He draws 3 cards, and then moves to combat. He decides to swing a total of 15 at Josh, before moving to end step. All of his pumps wear off, and he sacrifices Underworld Breach before turn passes. Josh drops an Exotic Orchard, and then casts Idyllic Tutor. He tutors up Hive-Mind to hand, and then casts it. Josh then casts his own copy of Underworld Breach, and follows it up with a Chance for Glory, and everyone gets into a debate about how to resolve this, as this happens.
That's something I'm gonna need to look up. So give me their phone to call Matt, actually.
And here's where a phone call to me clarifies what happened. So Josh is the active player, and his original copy of Chance for Glory is on the stack. Each of his opponents then copies the spell in priority order, thanks to Hive-Mind. The copies then resolve, starting with Danny. As each copy resolves, the person controlling it takes an extra turn at the end of this turn. Since Josh's copy is the last to resolve, it means that he'll be the first to take an extra turn, which also means that he's gonna need to have a way to deal with the lose the game trigger from Chance for Glory. After all of that resolves through, Josh escapes a Mystical Tutor, and each player copies it, before going to put an instant or sorcery on top of their respective deck. Danny goes to grab a Windfall, Devin grabs a Living Death, Michael grabs a Gamble, and Josh grabs a Time Stop. Josh then casts Talrand, and moves to his extra turn as he sacrifices Underworld Breach. Josh recasts Kykar. He follows up with an Impact Tremors, and creates a Spirit on that cast. He then casts his Time Stop. Everything triggers, and he first creates both a Spirit and a Drake, which each ping his opponents thanks to Impact Tremors. Each player then makes a copy of Time Stop thanks to Hive-Mind, and then the turn ends. Michael untaps, and Josh untaps his artifacts as well. Then on Michael's upkeep, Josh activates Orrery to draw 3 once again. He casts a Battle Hymn, and creates both a Spirit and a Drake on that cast, which once again shock his opponents. As the 4 copies of him resolve, each player adds red mana equal to the number of creatures they control. Michael gets to take his turn finally, and plays a Mountain. He casts a Mana Severance, and each player copies it as well, before going through their respective libraries, and choosing to exile all of their lands. Michael then casts a Goblin Charbelcher, and activates it, targeting Josh. He reveals no lands from his library, and still has more than enough cards left to eliminate Josh, who didn't draw into another instant. Michael then gambles, and tutors up a card, before randomly discarding Eternal Witness. Michael casts the Turnabout he tutored up, and chooses to untap his artifacts. At this point, he doesn't have a way to stop himself from losing to Chance for Glory, so he decides to go out with a bang and let fate randomly decide the winner. The die chooses Danny to die from Belcher, and then Michael moves to end step and loses the game, ultimately meaning that Devin walks away with the win.